Welcome to our panel presentation. We are thrilled again to have you. If I missed you in the opening session, welcome again if you're just joining us now. Today's opening panel brings together an incredible group of leaders from organizations across our field. I'm playing some interesting tunes in the background. The focus of our conversation is going to be about action. Welcome to our panel presentation. We are thrilled again to have you. If I missed you in the opening session, welcome again if you're just joining us now. Today's opening panel brings together an incredible group of leaders from organizations across our field. Okay, so thanks for bearing with us. That was apparently my fault. I also had the conference platform open. So we're going to start over. This is virtual, and this is what this is all about. So welcome again. I'm Bobbie. If you're just joining us, we're thrilled to have you today. Today's opening panel brings together an incredible group of leaders from organizations across our field. The focus of our conversation is about action. We're going to be talking frankly about the challenges, needs, and progress each of us is making and undergoing with their organizations as they work to deepen and advance equity across their work. I'm so appreciative to each of them for taking the time to be here today and for their willingness to come into today's session, ready to share and learn and to be vulnerable and authentic. In an effort to get right into it, I'm going to direct you to the bottom of your screen where you can click on each panelist's picture to read their impressive bios and experience. We only have an hour together, and our intention is to reserve 15 minutes for questions from attendees. So please use the chat function to go ahead and pose a question. So with that, I'd like to welcome our 4 panelists. With us this morning, we have Francesca Carpenter. Francesca is the Director of Equity Initiatives at Achieving the Dream. We have Mushtaq Gunja, who's the Vice President and Chief of Staff at the American Council on Education. Mushtaq will soon be transitioning from that role at ACE to be the new Executive Director for the Carnegie Classifications. We have Sharon Stroye with us, the Director of Public Engagement with the School of Public Affairs and Administration at Rutgers University-Newark. Sharon is also the Director of the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Center at Rutgers Newark, which is an initiative of AAC&U. And finally, we have Laurie Van Egeren, who is the Interim Associate Provost for University Outreach and Engagement at Michigan State University. And Laurie, like Sharon, is playing both a practitioner role and also a National Association role, where she is currently serving as President of the Engagement Scholarship Consortium. So welcome, everyone. We are going to dig right into it. So to get us started, I'd like to ask each of you to share 1 or 2 ways that you're deepening equity within your organizations right now. And please be specific. Let's start with you, Francesca.
So thank you, Bobbie. I'm glad to be here with everyone today. So it's important first that any organization that aims to support equity in their external work also focus on their internal structures. So at Achieving the Dream, we are committed to examining and redressing bias and inequities that are built into everyday decisions related to our policies, practices, and procedures. Now, we all know that equity work evolves, right? And as a leader in the higher education space, we know the importance of getting our house in order. But at the same time, we understand that equity work cannot wait until the house is perfectly clean and decorated before we start, right? External work must take place at the same time. Now, the colleges in our network are at different places on their equity journey, and we have laced up our sneakers and are on that journey with them. So what have we done specifically, right? Our staff have participated in deep level diversity, equity, and inclusion professional development, and more specifically, racial equity professional development. We are developing an internal equity statement that is spearheaded by our Culture and Equity Committee. and that will align with our external equity statement. We are examining which religious and cultural holidays are and are not official days off for our staff. We're redefining our onboarding processes based on our staff feedback to make sure we're setting everybody up for success. We are using intersectional disaggregated climate survey data to inform our decisions and challenge our assumptions and biases. And the last thing that I will mention is that we are examining how positionality, privilege, and power impact and influence an employee's ability to bring their full selves to work.
Love that. And Bobbie, thank you for having me. And I'm just so thrilled to be on this panel and to be able to mostly learn so much from the three of you. I'm just thrilled to be here. So ACE, what are we doing? I love that idea of thinking about getting your house in order, because we certainly have some work to do. All of us do, but ACE certainly has some work to do to get our house in order. And I sort of think about our work in a couple of buckets too, both the internal house in order work and also the substantive work that we are out there doing. So the next 12 months I think are going to be very, very focused on equity matters. So we're spending quite a bit of time thinking about and advocating for our institutions, especially our HBCUs and our MSIs, as it relates to the funding bills that are going through Congress right now, including Build Back Better. We have spent a lot of time in the last year and will continue advocating for Dreamers, including the creation of sort of a website and a whole program related to allowing institutions to sort of show their support for Dreamers on campus, and also some of the lobbying work. And we certainly know that race-conscious admissions is about to be in front of the Supreme Court. And so we have a significant amount of our time and our efforts going to be spent sort of gathering some survey data and then doing some briefing at the Supreme Court level, on behalf of our institutions as it relates to affirmative action, race-conscious admissions. Internally, though, we have work to do too. And I think the place where we're spending a lot of our time right now is in the return to work context. So we just last week sort of reopened our building. Everybody had been working remotely, or 95% of us have been working remotely. But we are still allowing a huge chunk of our staff to work remotely. And we're doing this on sort of a 6-month experiment basis, because we want to see sort of what the equity effects of sort of working from home versus working in the office will be, with sort of a specific emphasis on working parents, and thinking through, childcare issues. And we'll be doing sort of check-ins and surveys along the way there. So, we can go on for a bit, but for sort of in the interest of time, Bobbie, I think maybe I'll stop there.
Good morning, Bobbie. Thank you for having me. And Francesca, thank you for starting us off with getting our house in order, because that is exactly where, when I thought about the question, where I went to, not just as an institution. Rutgers University-Newark is part of a system. We have 4 locations in Newark, Camden, New Brunswick, as well as the medical school. So as one of the inaugural members of the National Network for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, our campus center has really been looking at what does it look like to be in the city of Newark, and not just to be here in Newark, but we're also of Newark. And how do we engage ourselves in the community? Fortunately for us in the system, as our president, Jonathan Holloway, first African-American president for a 250-year-old institution, he came in with a strategy: how do we create a beloved community? Our system is extremely complex. There we have autonomy in Newark, but we still answer to central administration. So his strategy for diversity, equity, and inclusion was basically a mandate for every department, academic unit to come up with a strategy. Using the TRHT framework, which looks at equity and diversity through a shared humanity perspective, the center has been working with the committees because each unit had to come together with a group of individuals from diverse backgrounds to design the strategy. But how do those individuals learn to work together if they've not actually been able to have challenging conversations, difficult discussions? So the TRHT Center utilizes the framework to work with those committees as they are developing their DEI strategy. Let's ensure that the committee is working in a cohesive manner where everybody's voice is heard and everybody's history and story is valued, to where we can meet the president's agenda and goal to having a beloved community throughout the Rutgers system.
I think I'm up. Yeah. Thanks, Bobbie, and thank you for the invitation. Sorry, and I'm like Mushtaq. I'm just so pleased to be here and just to learn, because I will definitely take more of a novice approach to this and tell you what we're doing from the perspective of very predominantly white organizations, and trying to work our way through where we go in establishing equity and justice within our systems. So I'm president of the Engagement Scholarship Consortium, and that group is really just beginning this work. So I'm going to speak in some ways because I just came in as president, and it's been a diverse in composition sort of a board. But I don't think DEI has been a particular focus of the organization to this point. So we have a lot of representation from different groups and different types of organizations and institutions in that group. But we're undergoing a strategic planning process, which I think is one of the first things to do around this. At Michigan State, in our office, though, we've been working on this for about 3 years to think about how to become a more equitable office. And what we really are is a convener. We're a facilitator between the university, the faculty, the staff, the students, and the community. We have a relatively small staff, so we are not the ones who do all the work. And that's very important, because that means, as Francesca was saying, we have to have our house in order to be able to facilitate anyone else. To be able to, we don't have all the expertise, and we don't have all the partnerships. And so what we've been doing is, prior to the George Floyd protests, we had begun this process of bringing together a group within our office, within our team, and we have about 100 people in our office, that really encompassed different positions, because we know that there are power differentials within higher education. We didn't want this to be a faculty initiative. This needed to be from support staff to faculty and academic staff. And really started working on developing our own understanding of what equity and justice and inclusion were. And over this period, and I'll say, I feel like we were ahead of many places because those protests hadn't started. And there was a very clear difference in how higher educational institutions reacted after that, prior to before. So it was something that was important, but then it became a crisis. And now we see all the impacts of that, from building diversity, equity, inclusion into promotion and tenure documents, to really thinking about committees and hiring chief diversity officers and people who can really support this work. So our office has really focused on building that capacity within our own unit, and asking each of our groups to identify short, medium, and long-term goals, which have included contributing to how engagement and equity and inclusion intersect, and helping colleges and departments define what that means for their faculty or academic staff going through a promotion process, and thinking about other institutional levers that we can support. And then the last thing we've been thinking about is essentially evaluating our partnerships and who is not included, who is not currently included in the partnerships that we have, and thinking about how we are able to build and work with partners to really figure out how the university can help, or work together with them to make a real impact in the communities in the ways that they identify.
That's great. I'm struck by, I appreciate all of those, and I'm struck by this general theme of, Francesca, where you started us, of this kind of needing to get your own house in order to do our work effectively. And I think all of us, whether we're at institutions in the community engagement space or we're at associations, and I can relate to that, having just made that transition, we're all in the business of really taking the assets of our institutions and organizations and helping them for bigger impact and outcome. And I think, you're charged to us early on, which is that's not going to be feasible and be grounded in equity if we don't have our own, our own house in order. And I'd like to use that as a basis for a next question, which I think it's at the core, and it's part of what we don't talk enough about when we're talking about this work. And that is the real struggle and the challenges that we face both as individuals and within our organizations. And something that is important to compact is that this is not about a victory narrative, right? The work that we're doing and what this conference is about helping us all really sit and work through the challenges and the critical conversations. And so I'd like to ask each of you to share one or even two, really challenges and struggles that you have, whether they are on a personal level and also within your organizations. And we'll just kind of work backwards. So Laurie, we'll kind of come back to you to start for this one.
I think I touched on this a little bit, which is that I tend to feel woefully incompetent at doing this work. I am constantly trying to learn, but I feel very concerned that I might not be as respectful as I can be, and I'm trying. Especially language. Language is a real stickler that catches me up, because no matter what kinds of language we're using, it's not necessarily the language that every group wants to be able to use. So whether we're talking about different groups or populations, and as a white cis woman, I very much understand that, and I want to be as respectful as possible, but I get very tangled up in trying not to be offensive to anybody. And I think this is one of the things that can really catch people, especially if you're in a predominantly white organization that is trying to do this kind of work, because I also don't want to put the burden on my colleagues to educate me. So it's a real process of trying to navigate that, but also be able to learn as much as possible. I think one of the other things that, and I want to say, I was looking at the Campus Compact competencies, and I think they do a phenomenal job of being able to talk about justice and equity without ever actually referring to any particular group. And that was kind of mind-blowing for me to be able to see that. So I'm going to take that back to my team and talk about how we can use that. The other thing I think is, as we were working with the groups that I work with, the team members, as we're trying to get our own house in order, is that I'm finding that as we're asking people to set goals, it's quite difficult for them to get to the systemic levers and really understand how they can reimagine their own work, as opposed to just adding another program or another training on. So that's been very interesting to me in thinking about how to proceed with the work.
Laurie, thank you for that comment. It makes me think about one of the things that we struggle with as part of the TRHT network. The goal of each TRHT campus center is to create the next generation of leaders to dismantle institutional structural racism through a shared humanity perspective. And the goal for AAC&U is to have 150 centers on colleges and universities to dispel this myth of hierarchy in human value. And one of the reasons is we see the hierarchy structure in higher ed at all levels, whether it's between faculty and staff, staff and students, students and faculty, the goals of the administration. And so how do we bring people together to just talk about our humanity? Let's eliminate the titles and the roles, and let's really look at that person's situation from their lens. We've been a TRHT campus center since 2017, before the COVID pandemic, before George Floyd, and the traction and success we built was with our students. Our students were willing to have these conversations. Whether we were willing or not, they were already meeting in private spaces. So the TRHT Campus Center helped formalize and create spaces and places where we can have these conversations. Well, COVID happened. George Floyd happened. And the engagement of the students has definitely dissipated. We are in an urban center. A significant number of our students are non-traditional, working parents, taking care of household. The COVID pandemic exacerbated those disparities that were already there, but it definitely had an impact on our students. And being able right now to reconnect, build community. No one anticipated 2 years of not being able to be in person to engage our students. And students have said to me, you know, Director Stroye, I appreciate what you're doing, but I'm over my head. I just cannot engage. And so how do we make sure that their voices are heard in, you know, in this space? Which also goes to something that you said, Laurie, where my colleagues, my white colleagues who don't necessarily feel that they belong in this space, I need their voices as well, or don't feel that they're competent or saying the wrong thing. Let's start with our humanity. We all have the same human spirit experiences. We have more in common than we do different. And so we use that framework to engage them to where they can feel comfortable, because I need all of their voices if we're going to see any transformation, especially in higher ed. I think it's essential.
Yeah, Sharon, I love that idea of sort of starting with the humanity. And Laurie, thank you for sort of sharing about how you feel about being woefully incompetent. I too feel woefully incompetent most days on most things, but especially on, you know, DEI related sort of matters where, you know, I come to this conversation with certain privileges and, you know, with certain. Everybody comes to these conversations in sort of a different place. And Sharon, so thank you for sort of centering us on our humanity. Bobbie, I know ACE is definitely not on a victory march. I don't come to this conversation with that. I can't even imagine sort of when we might be on a victory march, you know, with all the, when in our history we're going to be in a place where we will have accomplished what we need to accomplish. I feel like this is always going to be sort of a work in progress. Maybe I might say 3 things about ACE and sort of this, the struggles that I think we're facing. I mean, first, you know, ACE is a 100-year-old organization, you know, and I think whenever you've got that old an organization, like you just have a bunch of baggage that sort of comes with it. Like I sometimes wish that like we could start anew, you know, with a whole set of just new processes, procedures, new people that like wouldn't have all the attendant sort of problems. You know, in particular, we're working hard and we're struggling, I think, with some management training, you know, because among other things, we have a predominantly white leadership with a workforce. You know, our staff is almost 50% people of color. So, you know, that dynamic is one that we just need to work through and work on. And I think the good thing is that we recognize we've got some issues. You know, the hard thing is actually fixing them. And so we have brought in some management training leaders. We've been doing some good surveys that I think will put us in a place to start addressing the problem. But we have some work to do. You know, from a sort of an organizational DNA point of view, ACE is a membership organization. Probably many of the campuses that are watching are members of ACE. That's great. It also presents its own challenges, right? Because we are the big umbrella association that represents 4 years and 2 years and privates and publics. We represent institutions in red states that have very difficult and different politics than, you know, institutions that are in blue states. So we're constantly sort of dealing with tensions within the membership, right? So free community college, it splits our membership, right? Community colleges tend to be in favor of that. The other institutions tend not to be as much, right? Definitions of like MSIs and HSIs for funding purposes, right? These are significant, these can have significant ramifications. It splits our membership. So how ACE sort of deals with that, you know, and what our sort of common denominator is a huge struggle for us. We think about it all the time, you know, and I guess maybe the third thing I might note is, you know, I think we're often in a little bit of a struggle about when and how we speak out publicly about issues. So George Floyd, yes, you know, we make a statement, and I think we were right to do so. Ukraine, like, I don't know as much, right? All of these critical race theory bills, these anti-critical race theory bills, like we are very much for academic free speech, and we are very much against almost all of these bills that are going through these state legislatures. You know, do we speak out about each one? You know, when do we do it, and how do we sort of navigate the politics of some of our red state institutions that might not want to poke the bear as much as maybe we want to here in Washington? So, you know, just some, again, probably have 7 more struggles I could talk about, maybe just 3 that are sort of top of mind, at least this week for us.
So I will bring up the rear. So thank you all. I have a comment for each one of you, but I'm just gonna focus my response. So, you know, Achieving the Dream is also a network organization for community colleges specifically. We have a contingent of HBCUs and tribal colleges in our network as well. Now, with everything that's going on in the country, right, and everything that has been going on over the past few years, we have administrators, presidents, and leaders who agree that change in our organizations and our colleges is necessary, right? But they also realize that it's difficult to create that measurable, lasting change. And something that was mentioned earlier about defaulting to members of the community who experience prejudice and discrimination, they are often the ones who get asked advice, right, and for support. So that is a struggle. And so I just encourage everyone that, you know, being well-intended is the start of that conversation, right? You want to learn, but I really want to urge us to be mindful of the psychological and emotional labor that is incurred when people facilitate conversations around equity. Now, another one is that we know that equity is a shared action and it requires personal accountability, but we don't always see the personal accountability part. And so, again, what was mentioned is that sometimes hiring one position or one person in this role, people believe will come in and save, right? It will solve all of the equity challenges. That is not fair or accurate. And this era of this one person savior in a diversity officer role, that is over, right? This is a collective responsibility. And so the last thing that I'll mention quickly is that, you know, what trips up a lot of our colleges and a lot of people that I talk with when they're attempting to center equity is they use this phrase that they're looking at something through an equity lens. So what that implies is that people can pick and choose moments that they want to look at a situation with equity in mind, right? These are my fancy computer glasses. I can choose to take these on and off when necessary, right? But for people who experience inequities on a daily basis, there is not an option to remove an equity lens, right? So intersecting identities are not something that can be taken on and off. So that's a struggle that I have to keep reminding people to really be conscious of when you're using words and terminology, right? Again, well-intended, but what does it really mean? And what are you saying when you sit at a point of privilege where you can look at something through an equity lens when you choose to?
So I'm just taking it in. I love the symbolic also of, you know, the metaphor with the glasses. It's something that I think so many of our institutions and members can relate to because, and I wonder, just Francesca, if you feel like that's partially been an evolution. When I think back to my personal experience on campuses, it felt like developing equity lenses were the early part of the work. And when I think about, you know, those were some of the first conversations, like we should have an equity lens. And then when I think about where you're at now and Achieving the Dream, and you're saying we've had this external facing equity statement, we're now developing an internal equity statement. Do you see that, like, from kind of your perspective and stepping back in terms of how the work even around kind of the agenda of the work has shifted and just grown and changed?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I always say that equity work is evolving and that it is never finished, right? We are never done. So I don't know when we will get to a place where we have checked off the box of equity. I would like to, but I don't know if we will ever get there. I know that the work is growing and evolving and making an impact because the amount of legislation that is being proposed to combat it, right? There is so much push against growth, progress and justice, right, that we are seeing the reaction to that. So I know that this work is moving and growing, and more people are understanding the importance of it, right? This work takes all of us because it impacts all of us. This is not, like I said before, just a one person, one group's job, right? Until all of us are free, none of us are free. So it's important that we all understand we're in a community together.
So I'm going to jump into a question that we got because I think it really connects to what you just said about all of us being in it together. So one of the questions that came through right away was from Itai Laur, who was building off of your comment, Sharon, related to student voice, and asking, it'd be great to learn more about how others are sharing power with students in this journey within their organizations and in their work. And also, in addition to students, in our field, our community partners involved. So can anybody share kind of a reflection of how Sharon had some great examples. So if you want to start, Sharon, but others on how, I'm also struck by Francesca, your points about power and privilege. And Mushtaq, when you talk about the difference between the senior leadership, the team at ACE versus the workforce as a whole, and how this is all at play. So how are any of you sharing power with students around the co-creation of this journey?
Thank you. Thank you for that question, because I think it's extremely important when we are talking about this continuing work that Francesca definitely mentioned. It is continuing. It is every day, and it requires all of us. So in the beginning, when we became a center, one of the first things that we did was to make sure we include community partners. So the Newark Public Library was a strategic partner because we also wanted to not just have people come to the tower, to where they, we have residents in the city of Newark that still considers, this is an ivory tower and there's no place for me. So we decided to partner with the Newark Public Library to engage in conversations with the residents. But for a student voice, we have an advisory committee for the center that is made up of administration, staff, faculty, and students, undergrad and graduate. Here is my observation. When the students find themselves in the room with dean, director, professor, they self-select to be silent, where they don't think that their voice is actually valued in this space. And so for me, it would be intentional. I would be intentional. Okay, so student A, what is your opinion? I need to know, what do you think? Because the work that we're doing is for the next generation. So how are we designing work that is going to impact students, that's for the next generation, and they're not part of the planning process? And so there's an intentionality to have students lead the work that I'm doing in the community, to mentor them as from their undergrad to their graduate program, for them to be lead facilitators in the community, but also as well as on campus. We've had an opportunity where the American Association of Colleges and Universities, in their annual meeting, they would have a panel presentation. I need students to be on the panel. I don't need to be there. I need them to be on the panel. And so there is an intentional plan to make sure that their voices are there, especially sometimes when they feel like I'm just a student. No, you are the next generation of leaders that we need to continue the work that we're doing, that it needs to be everlasting. And so I don't see, as Francesca said, I don't know when we say job well done. I don't know what that looks like, but I need to make sure I create space for students to come in and pick up where I left off.
And I'll just jump in quickly. So, Achieving the Dream believes that colleges should be student-centered, right? And they're set up for the students. So we have a number of ways that we interact with students and bring students into the conversation. And one is storytelling. It is important for institutions to understand the lived experiences of their students, right? Students in one group are not a monolith, right? You have to dig deep and really build trust with students to understand what they are going through so that you can best support them. Another thing that I actually manage is what we call our Dream Scholars program. And so there are 8 students across the country selected who have contributed to their institutions and to the community. And we bring them into our annual convening, and they share, again, their stories. There is power in storytelling because it helps make a connection, and institutional leaders, faculty members are able to see themselves. We also are challenging our institutions to match their faculty and staff with the demographics of their student population. Do the faculty members look like the students sitting in the classroom? Can the students relate? Can they connect, right? Are the lived experiences similar, right? Do you have empathy for your students? What supports are being put in place that, again, see the whole student, the student parent, the immigrant student, the veteran student, right? What is at play at your institution that will make a student who's reluctant, right, come to your institution? Because different than what Sharon mentioned, community colleges sit in the community, right? They are hubs. So they are able to connect with partners all around the institution, right? And so we have institutions that create food pantries for their students, and clothing spaces where the items in those pantries represent the student population, right? We often don't think about that. Like, what is the makeup of your student body? Is a Muslim student going to be able to go into a clothing pantry type place and find wares that they can put on, right? Are some cultural things being represented in all of your support systems, right? So really focusing and setting your institution up so it meets the needs of the students, not the needs of the administration and faculty, per se. That's controversial.
Thanks. Mushtaq or Laurie, anything on that, just in terms of as we navigate thinking about where students fit into this and how we center and involve them in the process more directly? I would imagine that's more of a challenge at ACE. Yeah, go ahead, Laurie.
Go ahead, Laurie.
I'll just say that from the Engagement Scholarship Consortium hat, which is Engagement Scholarship Consortium is a consortium of different institutions. Right now we have 42. We would love to have you, a member institutional membership. And so it's got institutions from public land grant, big R1s to like local. Swarthmore actually is one of our partners. So I was excited to hear when Nicole Springer was talking about being part of the ESI. So a variety of institutions with really different approaches or foci on students. So some of those engaged scholarship activities really focus on engaged scholarship as student engagement, community engaged learning. Some of them are more focused on engaged research, and it's a real variety. Every institution has different ways and different sort of councils and structures to get student voice or to get community voice. And I will tell you that there's a lot of interest in hearing the sharing of those models. So, I think anywhere where we're able to say, here's what our institution is doing, here's what our institution, as much as this panel is doing, but able to bring those together into one set of resources or one set of descriptions, other institutions will find it very, very helpful to be able to understand that and modify or adapt to their own institutions.
Yeah, and Bobbie, I think it is a little bit harder, or maybe we've just made it a little bit harder for us to sort of have the student voice, impact our day-to-day work. I mean, certainly, like Francesca, I think the vast majority of our institutions are student-centric, probably need to be a little bit more student-centric, or at least some of them do. But, we have theoretically, right? We are a membership organization of institutions that are serving the students, and reminding them of that, I think, is really important. ACE was founded actually really to serve sort of veterans that were returning from World War I and trying to get some sort of education. And so adult learners and military learners are very much in ACE's DNA. And I think it's important for us to sort of broaden that out to all sort of learners, not just a certain set of sort of adult learners that I think we spend a lot of time sort of thinking about. But we've got some work to do in that score.
So I wanted to add that I'm struck by, I appreciate all the comments. And, Sharon, when you started us talking about kind of putting those students into positions to kind of be lead facilitators, something that I want to offer from Compact's perspective, where I think we can really be helpful across our institutions, is giving our students the tools, to effectively be in position, not just listening again, but putting them in a place of activism and leadership. And some of that is really around dialogue. It's something we are talking a lot about at Compact. There's lots of dialogue resources. There's lots of dialogue practices. We're trying to do what Compact does really well, which is kind of bring together all of those resources and help our institutions and members understand the various paths. So be on the lookout for that. We're thinking about it from a credentialing standpoint, a resource standpoint, and really a research standpoint of how we provide these kind of deliberative dialogue tools as pathways for students to really feel like they have the tools and capacity to facilitate this work. So I have two questions I hope I want to get to. There's been more that come in, but two that really struck me that I think are really poised for this group. The first one kind of gets to the vulnerability question. And it's stated that, do you think this shared feeling that particularly Laurie and Mushtaq talked about around inadequacy or incompetence in this field is exacerbated by our academic environments, by the field that we're working in? And, how can we create a culture of vulnerability that moves this work forward? What are the things we need to do? What do we need to change?
It sure feels like it's exacerbated. I'm sorry, Laurie. I would just say it sure feels like it's exacerbated by the professor-student sort of dynamic, especially in the classroom, where the professor is supposed to be the expert of everything, and, if that person is not vulnerable in and of themselves, I think it really makes for a very difficult set of relationships. And I think it's especially hard in a landscape where our students are changing, that we have more first generation, more people of color coming in, if the folks that are in those positions of power, are not, the students don't see themselves reflected and aren't interacting with people that are vulnerable, man, I feel like that makes life really, really difficult for our students. So what makes this, I think, particularly challenging is there are so many touch points that our students have on a day-to-day basis with people that probably are not as vulnerable as they could be or need to be, probably. So yes, I think it's exacerbated here. I think it's easier to deal with some of these issues, easier to help solve some of these issues in smaller organizations, but enormous universities are a hard place, I think.
So I actually want to give an example of what the TRHT campus centers, all of them across the country. When we started, we were part of the 10 in 2017. There are now 55 to 57 campus centers across the country. And one of the tools, the foundational tool that we use, is called a racial healing circle. It is an opportunity. Before COVID, we would meet in person with diverse groups from all backgrounds, all different places, to come together and engage in an interactive experience where we're, to Francesca's point, where we're actually sharing stories. But we're sharing stories about our own lived experiences. Unfortunately, because every aspect of our life has been grounded in this construct of race, when you start sharing those stories, racism, oppression, discrimination, prejudice, it comes to the top where you can't get away from it. And so in the racial healing circle, there is intentionality to have faculty, staff, students, administrators, people who are all in the same conversation. And when they introduce themselves, we don't ask them what their title is. What is your name, your birth order, or where was your great-grandparents born? That eliminates the conversation, the conversation of hierarchy. And so now you start talking about grandparents. Everybody has one. Everyone talks about it. It may be positive, it may not be positive, but that is the foundational tool that we use to create this culture of vulnerability. And it is in that space when that storytelling is occurring that you realize, wow, I have the same situation. Because of COVID, we had to do virtual. And so we send two people into a breakout room that is complete strangers, and they have to share a personal story. It's essential that whoever's facilitating, that the space, they feel safe, psychological safety, acknowledging that if they don't want to share, they don't have to share. But we have found that once you engage them in that conversation, they leave with a different perspective. For example, we needed to do some work with faculty members at a community college, and we got into a conversation about who named them. 30 minutes. I just thought it was an introductory question. 30 minutes about who named them. But however, at the end of the conversation, they're at a school where 80 to 90% of their students are BIPOC. So if you're the faculty member, to Mushtaq's conversation, that sits in the position of power, do you take the time to pronounce their name correctly? Do you see them in pronouncing their name? Do you take the time to validate learning your student's name? Our brothers and sisters from Asian countries come in and adopt an American name because they don't think anybody's going to take the time to pronounce their name correctly. At the end of that session, one of the faculty members said, I'm going to take the time to pronounce their name correctly. It may seem small to someone, but to a person where English is not their first language, that you, as the faculty member, you respect pronouncing their name correctly, you are validating their identity. But it's because they were engaged in this racial healing circle, we made the connection about, you like people to say your name correctly, do you say your students' names correctly? So all of the TRHC campus centers are trained in hosting and facilitating racial healing circles and workshops about using lived experiences to make the correlation to how you live versus how somebody else lived may be different. Do you see yourselves in that situation?
Thanks, Sharon. We've had a couple of TRHT programs in the community around here and have been able to see the impacts of the racial healing circles as well. I'm going to speak a little bit from an institutional perspective, and as somebody who's in upper administration as well as a leader of an organization and some others as well that are trying to work together to build this work in and actually make it meaningful. It's very difficult because we are in a completely expert culture. Being a faculty member is all around one's expertise. That's what you're rewarded for. That's what you're valued for. And I admire the many, many faculty that I've been able to see who are able to give that up and at least be able to say, I'm working with different groups and I have a piece of expertise, but you all have a piece of expertise too. And let's bring that together to make something greater, especially if they can work with community in that way, because, community has the expertise about most of the things, and your contribution is probably a relatively limited one as a faculty member. It might be very impactful, but it's specific. So I think that you have to be vulnerable as a leader to be able to make any difference in this, because you have to be the model for that. And if you're not the vulnerable one, nobody else is going to feel comfortable enough to do that. But there are still the power differentials between, I'm the boss of people who are on my DEI committee. How do they know that I'm not going to be reactive to something that they say? And they don't. And I think, we've managed to work through a lot of it, but there's always that underneath. You're going to have to trust me. And if you don't trust me, I respect that. I understand. Same thing for me. If I'm being vulnerable in a context like this, that's risky, right? So I think that vulnerability is just a leap of faith, and one has to be prepared to take the consequences of being vulnerable. And not everybody is, and that's understandable and okay. But you can't make any change just by policies. You have to be able to have those honest conversations. And even if you're ready to have those, like I've always said, yeah, I can have the difficult conversations. Well, it turns out the ones that I didn't expect to be difficult are the difficult ones. So it's always a surprise about what's actually going to end up being like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. I do that. We do that. So being able to talk about those things, is at least the move forward.
So I'll be quick so we can take some more questions from the audience. So, learning and growing happens in the discomfort and in those disorienting dilemmas that we face, right? Those difficult conversations and making those unpopular decisions. But once you do those things, then you have shown that you are trustworthy, right? You have the student's best interests, the administrators, faculty, staff's best interests at heart, because you are willing to go out on a limb for them. I would also say that a lot of this whole conversation around vulnerability also speaks directly to creating a sense of belonging. And how do you do that for your students? There are a lot of different ways, but safe spaces, exactly what Sharon said, calling students by their name, pronouncing it correctly, using their preferred pronouns, right? Making sure that you are available at times that they can see you, right? Taking into account that they might be parents, they might be working full time. Really creating an environment where they feel welcomed and that they belong, seeing signage that looks like them, documents in different languages, right? Making the connections that are necessary so that trust is built, and then I can be vulnerable with you and you then with me. Right. So we are sharing stories again. Stories are powerful. So sharing the stories and experiences up front and asking questions, having students only have to tell their story of need or housing insecurity or food insecurity one time so that they're not traumatized multiple times in telling their story, right? They now trust you and believe that the institution and all of the people in it have their best interests at heart. So they'll be more apt to share and be vulnerable with you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think this will be our last question before I ask each of you to share a closing word. Dan Richard asked, and I'm going to just make a slight tweak to it just in the interest of time. He says, I'm seeing a theme of on the journey, but that there's still a lot of work to do. I'm interested to hear about what are some positive first steps. So I'm going to ask for a positive first step. Some things that have happened initially that seemed easier. What are those entry points for this work? And he asked about what other areas along the path, but let's just stick to a positive first step. What's something that kind of is that accessible on-ramp for folks who are watching today, who are thinking about, I want to advance this. I'm just really hungry for some practical steps I can take initially. And let's go back up. Francesca, do you want to start?
Yeah, so let me think about that. So I would say the very first thing is to be open to learning, read as much as you can, consume as much information as you can from both sides, right? It's important to know what it is that you don't know and to be ready to combat criticism or critique, right, when it may come your way. I would say that. I would say, again, be vulnerable. Know that you might make mistakes and missteps, apologize, and we're all in this together, right? So we will forgive and continue. We're all learning. And then the last thing I will say is just be open-hearted and know that we all have multiple things happening and it impacts students different ways, right? And so just being considerate of that. But I would say first and foremost, continue to learn and start the conversation at the easiest place that you feel you can with whoever it is you're talking to, right? There are different entry points with different audiences.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it is easier to not have some of those difficult conversations rather than have them and then sort of apologize for sort of misstepping when you do. I think it is better to have them knowing that you might make a mistake and then sort of have built a culture of sort of open-heartedness, as Francesca, you said, than to not have them at all. I mean, certainly I think avoiding the topics just kicks the can down the road a little bit for a bigger blow up probably later. One smallish thing or one positive step that I think that ACE has made We engaged Google to do a workplace survey for us. And I'm really happy that we did. Not all of the news that came out was happy. Some of it was, and some of it was not. But it identified the places where I think we can start tackling the work. And I think that's a good place to start. I think if you haven't done, a survey of your institutions, your organization, your students, wherever you sort of sit, I think doing one and doing sort of a rigorous one might be a good place to gather at least some information about where the work needs to start. So I've been happy that we did it, and I've been happy with the results.
I think one place to start is asking questions of those individuals that have a different background than you. Hopefully you have a trusted relationship with someone that has a completely different experience, and be willing to acknowledge what you don't know and just ask questions and ask them to share about their stories, their journeys, their experiences. As Francesca said, reading, learning, and doing internal assessment, but also asking questions about what you don't know from somebody that is extremely different than you.
And I'm going to double up because I know we're at the end of the session, so I'm going to sort of use my small wins answer as my final comments, because I know it really ties into what we've all been talking about. And I think that is that for small or fast wins, addressing both a policy change and developing. So for example, a policy change such as reviewing your hiring policies and your search policies for new positions, and really making sure that you're addressing a variety of being inclusive about people and their qualifications, and thinking out of the box in terms of who might be available to fulfill those roles in your group. And then at the same time, having a very intentional group of people who are invested. They might not be knowledgeable yet, or they might just be beginning their journey, but they're interested, and having regular conversations, whether it's weekly or monthly, with that group, to be able to have the dialogues and begin developing your core of people who are who then become the advocates and are increasing their knowledge to go forward. And we found that to be some wins for us in both of those things, even though it's continuing to progress.
Thank you all for that. So we're just about out of time. I think what we have time left for is just a closing comment or word. And so I'd like to ask each panelist just to share something that stood out for them, something that was shared today that's top of mind as we head into the rest of our day. And so we'll just kind of go in backwards order. Laurie, are you up for starting?
Well, I sort of did it, but getting your house in order. I'll just leave us with that.
Laurie, I was going to say the same thing. Cleaning the house, external and internal.
I just a lot of gratitude for letting me be part of this conversation. I had my pencil. I've been taking notes, and I have definitely a few things I want to take back to the organization. So thank you for letting me be here.
And so I'll finish. I want to say again, thank you all for the conversation. I learned a lot from listening to everyone today. And so, I thought of a quote yesterday that is appropriate and it works, right? It's by Audre Lorde, and it says, when things are hard, do something. If it works, do it some more. If it does not work, do something else, but keep going. And so I want to encourage everyone to keep going, because the stakes are way too high to settle for inaction. So thank you, Bobbie, for this opportunity.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. I want to, so what I was going to say, and I want to close with this, is I've been struck by all of you and, making this so much about the person, and sharing so much about the human-centered nature of this and the shared humanity that we have. And I'm left with, when we think about this work, that it's really sometimes easier to think about investing in projects or investing in initiatives or any of the things, but what we really need to do is invest in the people. And I'm left with that, all of this work, the deep work that's necessary, is really prioritizing the people involved, and that's students, our employees, our members, and of course our community. As we wrap today, I just wanted to share such a gratitude for all of you. You know, like everyone knows who's done these, you know, you're trying to bring people together. Everybody's got a lot going on. Laurie has a really cute, very quiet dog in the background who almost you wouldn't believe is real, the way it's just casually walking back and forth. And Sharon in our prep calls was playing grandma for her beautiful grandson Elijah that when Francesca and I met. And I know Mushtaq is teaching this afternoon in Crim for Georgetown. So I just want to say thank you. I know all 4 of you are so busy and have so much going on. I felt like this has been a really rich conversation, and I'm really appreciative. And I want to let all of our attendees know, as Nicole mentioned, this is the beginning of the Choose Your Own Adventure time. So be sure to go into the networking spaces or in the rooms and lean in with one another. And with that, we'll say goodbye.